Okay, so what's the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator? These are two of the main programs we're going to be using in this class. What's the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator? What it boils down to is pixels versus vectors. Okay, so if you look at Photoshop, Photoshop is constructed based on pixels. So if you zoom in here, we can zoom in as far as we want. Let's zoom in to 1000%. See, this image, this Photoshop image, is constructed of tiny little squares. These are what are called pixels, okay? So Photoshop images are constructed by different colored pixels. And when you zoom out, your eye and your brain can't resolve those individual pictures, so you get what appears to be very, very sharp images. But make no mistake, if you zoom in, you can actually see the pixels. And in Photoshop, you can edit these pixels. So if I want to change the color of these pixels, I can do that. I can change the color of individual pixels in Photoshop. What's Illustrator? Okay, Illustrator is completely different. Illustrator is made of vectors. So these are mathematical algorithms that tell the program what colors to display in what regions of the image. It's designated by mathematics, okay? And so like if you were to zoom in, let's zoom in 100-fold. Here's kind of a boring picture. Let's zoom back out. It's kind of a boring picture of some farms. Let's zoom out. This is actually for a scientific publication that we're working on, where we're looking at some chicken farms. Okay, and this is a good example of when you would want to use Illustrator. Anytime you're abstracting and sort of developing a cartoon kind of illustration, Illustrator is a great choice. And if you are to zoom in now, let's zoom into 1000%. You do not see the pixels. It's still as sharp as can possibly be, even zoomed in at 1000-fold or 500-fold or 250-fold. It always maintains its sharpness, okay? And that is because the vectors communicate with the computer through mathematics. It can always be infinitely sharp, no matter how big or small the image is, no matter how you resize the image, no matter how you view the image, it's always infinitely sharp because of the mathematics. So you might ask the question, if Illustrator is always sharper, why would we ever use Photoshop, right? Like, why would we ever want an image that was pixelated? Pixelated, you could consider that as bad. And the answer is that many times it's very useful for us to edit the individual pixels, and we cannot do that in Illustrator. So there's pluses and minuses to each program, and you will eventually learn when you should use one versus when you should use the other. But both of the programs present a very different sort of aesthetic style in the output. Okay, Photoshop is essentially like paintings, okay? And Illustrator is very cartoony, very it's for illustrations. That's its name, Illustrator. It's for illustrations. Illustrator is also harder to use because it's vector based, because it's based in the mathematics. It's actually harder to use. So that's why we start in Photoshop, because it's a lot more simple. The idea that an image is made of individual pixels and that you can change the color of each pixel, that's very easy to understand. And so it's also easier to implement and use the interface of Photoshop. And once you learn the interface of Photoshop, it makes learning Illustrator a little bit easier. So I always start the semester with Photoshop so that you can sort of use it as a segue into learning Illustrator later in the semester.